By 1945, the twilight of the Third Reich had drawn near. Even the most delusional of Hitler's supporters could see the writing on the wall, and the once unstoppable Wehrmacht had been reduced to a feeble shadow of its former glory. With Soviet troops now bearing down on the capital of Berlin, and the German war industry barely able to maintain a trickle of new vehicles, each with a life expectancy of days to weeks, the defenders were forced to go to extreme lengths to procure new tanks. As grisly, miserable, and violent as these times were for those experiencing them, they are fascinating to explore in hindsight, demonstrating the ingenuity of men pushed to their absolute limits. It is unknown which desperate engineer first had the idea of mounting a spare Panzer IV cannon onto a Panzer I, but he must be acknowledged for his willingness to tackle such a project as bombs and artillery shells rained down upon him and the rest of his beleaguered unit. The results of their labor never lasted long enough to receive a formal designation, but it is informally known as the Panzer I Ausf.B mit 7.5 cm StuK 40. For the sake of easy narration, we'll simply call it the Panzer I Pak 40. As with a depressing number of these fascinating vehicles, all information currently known about the Panzer I Pak 40 comes from a single photograph, likely taken by a Soviet photographer wandering around the ruins of Berlin after the surrender. This does at least confirm the existence of the vehicle and hints at what happened to it. Even when it first saw combat in 1939, the Panzer I was obsolete, and only fielded because more advanced vehicles had barely even rolled off the prototype stage. Once these were available, the tank was quickly relegated to a training role. The Panzer I Pak 40 is clearly using an Ausf.B hull, which was the second production model of the Panzer I, after the Ausf.A. The two models differed primarily in terms of engine and suspension, with the Ausf.B having a Maybach NL38TR supplying 100 horsepower at 3000 RPM to 5 road wheels with 4 return rollers. Due to its obsolescence, it is unlikely the vehicle had an illustrious combat history prior to conversion, and probably spent most of the war as a crew trainer. When it was first introduced, the Panzer I fielded an almighty arsenal of 2 MG-13 7.92mm machine guns. This was significantly inferior even to the Renault FT, which was introduced in 1917. As the war progressed, many Panzer I hulls were modified into self-propelled guns or anti-tank platforms, stripping out the turret and much of the internals in favor of mounting heavier weaponry. These more well-known modifications provide important insight into the potential issues faced by the Panzer I Pak 40, chiefly the overloaded suspension and inadequate engine power. In its vanilla configuration, the Panzer I Ausf.B weighed in at 5.8 tons and could manage 40 km an hour on the best roads, dropping to 15 km per hour cross-country. The addition of the 7.5 cm gun from the Panzer IV likely added over 2 tons to the vehicle, placing enormous stress on the simple leaf spring suspension and slowing it to a crawl. The picture shows that the tracks are partially dug into the ground, indicating that the vehicle may have been abandoned due to getting stuck. It may have also simply broken its tracks or suspension by firing the gun, thanks to the enormous recoil forces involved. That said, the mere fact the Panzer I Pak 40 was ever functional in the first place is a testimonial to the skill, or desperation, of the engineers who worked on it. To accommodate the gun, the turret and upper frontal armor plates had to be removed, while some parts of the rear armor had to be slightly cut down. An unidentified round-shaped object that casts a shadow on the superstructure may indicate an improvised seat for a loader, or just a crude addition to the gun deck to give the crew more space to work with. Another, larger flat plate can be seen in front of it, which appears to be an addition to the vehicle and not part of the original superstructure. Again, this is most likely a part of the new gun deck. As with many self-propelled guns, improvised or otherwise, crew protection is pretty limited. The Panzer I never had impressive armor to begin with. The thickest was around 13mm at the front. Without an enclosed turret, the crew would have had to huddle awkwardly behind an improvised shield welded around the 7.5cm gun, which would have been no more than a few millimeters thick at most. Earlier in the war, this would have been okay, as the excellent Pak-40 could easily land hits far beyond the effective ranges of its Soviet counterparts. But this was 1945, and the crew would be facing tanks like the T-34-85 and the IS-2. The 85mm gun on the T-34 could match the Pak-40 in every aspect. Meanwhile, a single shot from the monstrously powerful 122mm cannon fielded by the IS-2 could reduce the Panzer I to an interesting collection of metal scrap capable of fitting in the average wheelbarrow. This further adds credibility to the idea that the Panzer I Pak-40 was abandoned due to mechanical failure or the crew's position being overrun by infantry, as any duel between it and contemporary Russian tanks would have left very little worth being photographed. That being said, the power of the 7.5cm StuK 40 L48 gun was still not to be underestimated. Originally developed by Krupp and Rheinmetall in 1942, this one was likely salvaged from a damaged StuK 3. The initial production model came with a barrel length of L43, but this was increased to 48 calibers later in the same year. The gun featured a semi-automatic breech that ejected the spent cartridge after firing, enabling a new round to be quickly fed into the mechanism, which was fired electrically. Sadly, we haven't a clue about the elevation, depression, or traverse limits for the one mounted on the Panzer I Pak-40, and it depends on how long the engineers had to adapt the firing platform to the Panzer I hull. Though hardly the scourge of Russian tank crews it had once been, the 7.5cm gun could still make an eloquent and persuasive argument for its continued relevance on the battlefield. The weapon was extremely accurate, aided by the Selbstverlaufhätten-Ziffernrohr gun sight used for direct targets and the Rundblickfernrohr 32 or 36 for indirect fire. Using these tools, a German gunner could expect to reliably land shots at distances of up to 3.3 kilometers with the high explosive shells. Armor-piercing rounds fired from the gun can penetrate 85mm of armor sloped at 30 degrees at a kilometer, but could penetrate lighter vehicles out to 2.3 kilometers. These favorable statistics meant that the Panzer I Pak-40 could still be a deadly threat to all but the heaviest Soviet tanks, especially if it carefully deployed in a favorable position with adequate cover. Speaking of positioning, the details in the background of the photograph give us various important clues as to where it was taken, and what the Panzer I Pak-40 was doing before being abandoned. Berlin's mightiest defenses were its three immense flak towers, vast, heavily reinforced concrete bunkers festooned with the largest anti-aircraft guns Germany could muster. During the Battle of Berlin, over 30,000 German civilians took refuge within these vast fortress complexes, and not even the strongest Soviet artillery pieces were able to penetrate their walls, which were in some cases over 3.5 meters thick. One of these flak towers is clearly visible in the background of the photograph taken of the Panzer I Pak-40, so it must have been stationed nearby. We can immediately exclude Flakturm Humbelheim from consideration, as it was built on a small hill, while the terrain in the picture is flat and level. Meanwhile, the command tower of Zoo-Bunker lacks the 4-round concrete platform shown in the picture, meaning it likely belongs to Volkspark Friedrichshain Tower. Taking these details into account and comparing them to aerial photographs of Berlin taken during the final days of the war, it's possible to place the Panzer I Pak-40's location with a reasonable degree of accuracy. Though this is pure conjecture, it seems fair to assume the vehicle and its crew were part of the defense force keeping the Volkspark Friedrichshain command tower from being overrun by Soviet forces. If they saw combat, the 2 or 3 man crew were probably forced to use the vehicle like a static turret, as they would not have had either the fuel or additional vehicles needed to tow the Panzer I chassis out of danger when the suspension or track links inevitably broke down from the extra weight and recoil of the oversized gun. Another far more mundane analysis suggests that the vehicle may have been deployed elsewhere and was simply dragged to the location to await dismantling for scrap. Regardless of the exact position or combat history of the Panzer I Pak-40, it remains an obvious weapon of last resort. No engineer worth his salt would ever have suggested such an impractical pairing of gun and chassis if there were any feasible alternatives present. Were it not for the verifiable authenticity of the photograph in question, one would be forgiven for dismissing the whole idea as an entertaining hoax. Yet, it's important to remember context. These were the darkest days in German history, when projects like the Me-163 Comet and even more impractical BA-349 Natter were considered worth pursuing. Basically, if there was even a chance that a proposed weapon system might work, somebody in the German military was desperate enough to give it a try. Much like everything else about its existence, the fate of the Panzer I Pak 40 is up to speculation. Sadly, the chances of its survival even long past the German surrender declaration is close to zero. By this point, the Soviets had as many German trophies as they could ever possibly want, and a little obsolete broken down curiosity like a Panzer I mounting a 7.5 centimeter gun would never have been deemed worth preserving. It was almost certainly torn apart for spare parts and scrap metal soon after the armistice, a sad end to a lame duck of a vehicle. This brings our look at the Panzer I Ausf.B with 7.5 cm StuK 40 to a close. With so many unknowns, definitive conclusions are hard to come by. Do you think this poor little tank ever fired a shot in anger? Do you think the crew fought to the last man, or had the good sense to flee when their situation became hopeless? Are there any other obscure and bizarre vehicles of last resort you'd like us to cover? Tell us in the comments below, and don't forget to check out the Tank Encyclopedia website for more in-depth coverage of vehicles like this.